every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Author and lecturer Peter Dale Scott has a talent for uncovering political references that are often overlooked by others. He has written an impressive number of poems, articles, and books on political issues of significant importance. His ability to see the political system as a whole provides a unique perspective to the forces that govern the lives and the events of the American people. His books, The Iran-Contra Connection, Cocaine Politics, and his new book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, are but a few examples of his extensive research investigations. In this video series, we will focus on Peter Dale Scott's perceptions of politics in the United States. In doing so, a new light will be cast on the major scandals that have affected our society: Watergate, the Iran-Contra affair, and the assassination of John F. Kennedy. To understand these incidences, we must first look to the forces that initiated them. According to Peter Dale Scott, their roots in political corruption started with the banana companies. In part one of this series, Peter Dale Scott will delineate just how the fruit companies, unions, organized crime, and the CIA joined together to establish the foundations for deep politics in the United States. Now, you've just recently written the book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. Deep politics. What do you mean by that? Help us define that.
I must say, you know, the Vietnam War was a great tragedy, but it was also an education, I think, for many, many Americans, and certainly for me. And I decided that my early analysis of the war, which was, you know, the interests of the oil companies who wanted to drill in the South China Sea, and the interest of the government and the CIA in stopping Chinese communist influence in the region, that although all of this analysis, I don't renounce any of it, it wasn't false, but I think it also wasn't fully aware of the nature of the problem, and that is that there were political processes going on which we don't generally recognize, and that's what I call deep politics, anything that is under the surface, that is not generally recognized, rather like the unconscious in the human psyche. We also have political processes going on in our country that are not generally recognized, but they are not just parapolitics. They're not something that was dreamed up in some CIA headquarters. They're things which just go on. And if we want to understand why certain apparently irrational events happen, like the U.S. becoming involved in Vietnam, we have to look more closely at these deep political factors.
You use a word that is kind of new to me, parapolitics.
Yes.
Tell me what it is. What do you mean by that?
Well, I defined it in The War Conspiracy as the system or process of politics in which accountability is consciously diminished. That is to say, you are controlling things or influencing events, but you take pains to conceal the fact that you are doing that.
So this is the covert type of...
Yes, anything that is covert and consciously covert is parapolitics.
In your book, Cocaine Politics, You refer to the corruption in some of our Central American nations through the two American companies, two fruit companies, Standard Fruit and United Fruit. And you tie the political corruption in their nations to them, and also back here to the United States. Tell us something about that.
Well, here we're talking about the so-called banana republics in Central America, where the governments came and went at the pleasure of the U.S. companies that were there. It wasn't just the banana companies, but I had reason to write about them in particular. The country of Honduras, for example, is the classic banana republic. When you had three banana companies operating in Honduras, you had three political parties, each one financed by a banana company. When two of the companies merged into United Fruit, then you only had two political parties in Honduras. Politics in Honduras were corrupt before the banana companies moved in a big way. But in 1911 in Honduras, you had a coup which was financed by one of the banana companies, and which was actually plotted in the red light district of New Orleans with a mercenary character, former New Orleans policeman called Guy Maloney, representatives of the fruit company, which no longer exists, and with the politician who became the new president of Honduras. That was, I mean, there have been many, many similar coups, but that one deserves our attention in particular because it marked the end of an era in which the corruption in Honduras was financed by European railway companies and financial companies who held the bonds of Honduras and would stage coups in order to ensure payments on their bonds. Now the banana companies became the center of power in Honduras. The story is a little more complicated in some of these other countries like Guatemala and Nicaragua, but the model is the same, that the company, the U.S. company, the banana company, is bigger than the government, and when it's dissatisfied with a particular government, then the banana companies can displace those governments, and they did so repeatedly. They were always looking for strong men, but even strong men could become a little too uppity for the fruit companies. And, of course, this was disastrous for democracy in that region, which was healthier, I would say, in the first decades of this century than it was 30 or 40 years later, after 3 or 4 decades of U.S. intervention, initially through the banana companies, and then later the banana companies in alliance with the CIA, like the 1954 coup in Guatemala. But it introduced a sense of despair and hopelessness in Central America, where the only logical response ultimately was armed revolution, like the Sandinistas. And the banana companies have had, and I think still have, a big responsibility for that kind of political despair.
So they have really affected the politics in a number of nations other than the ones they were directly involved in. United States?
Well, yes. I mean, I'd like to come back to domestic corruption as a separate category later on, but it certainly has redefined the U.S. posture vis-a-vis the rest of the world, not just in Central America. Once the United States becomes identified around the world as a country that will run coups like the 1954 Guatemala coups, then of course it breeds an enormous amount of anti-Americanism and forces the United States to have to defend itself in a much more militant way throughout the world, not just in Central America.
When did the CIA get involved in Central America, and what is their connection, or do they have a connection with the fruit companies?
Yes, well, they got involved in covert operations right away, within a year of being created, but the focus then was in Italy, and many people would defend what the CIA did there because it was putting money behind central and right-wing parties at a time when Russia was pretty certainly putting money behind the left-wing Communist Party. So there was a kind of tit-for-tat situation. They were involved in Central America certainly by the very early 1950s, and there's no similar rationale. I mean, it was argued in terms of stopping the Soviet menace in Guatemala, but this was a pure fiction. The Soviet Union at that time had no interest in going into Guatemala, and what we overthrew was not a communist party, but a democratically elected bourgeois party whose crime was threatening to expropriate land owned by the United Fruit Company, which the United Fruit Company wasn't using. They weren't even going to go after the plantations which were being used, and the unthinkable crime ultimately was that they were going to compensate the United Fruit Company at the value which the United Fruit Company itself had put on that land for tax purposes in Guatemala. And that's why the CIA intervened in Guatemala and many, many other countries to protect the banana companies or any companies which were faced the possibility of expropriation and, from their point of view, inadequate compensation. That was the role in Chile, which had nothing to do with the fruit companies, but big mining, copper companies, mining companies. The list is very extensive.
In this milieu of political corruption, does organized crime play a role?
Oh, yes, absolutely, particularly with the banana companies in Central America. If you go back to their predecessor companies in the 19th century, you find that one branch of the family became what we call a fruit company, and then another branch of the family became what we call mafia or organized crime.
The enforcers.
The enforcers. And it was a case of a kind of power vacuum on the docks, which the labor unions, bona fide labor unions, were trying to fill. And in fighting those labor unions, the fruit companies contributed to a situation where the real power became the mafia. Now, I've seen one book which blamed Standard Fruit, in particular, Banana Company, for the domination of the New York waterfront by Anastasia and the New York mafia. But this is not a parapolitical situation. It's not like the banana companies dreamed up the mafia. It was more a genuine, bona fide, deep political power crisis in which what emerged was a symbiosis between the fruit companies on the one hand and the mafia on the other, initially for maintaining some kind of order on the docks. Now, this alliance, that de facto alliance, proved very useful when the fruit companies started installing and replacing governments in Central America. And the same allies, mafia, that they had on the waterfront became their allies, their enforcers, as you say, for Central America as well. Now, many, many people have written about the CIA and linked it to the corporate interests of the United States. But if they're traditional Marxists or if they're traditional political scientists, they've ignored what I call the deep dimension, the organized crime dimension to this picture. It is absolutely structural in the sense that you would not have had the coups you had over 40 years if you had only had the corporations and the CIA. You also needed this kind of unrecognized but really functional part of the power situation, which was organized crime gangs.
Now, Lee Harvey Oswald, he's another personality that had a lot to do with New Orleans, and we're citing upon New Orleans for the criminal element and from the unions and the fruit companies. Mm-hmm. But he also had a great experience in that area. Let's get into Lee Harvey Oswald and some of the things that have to do with his activities.
Yes, I'd like to actually talk about, I'll come back to Oswald, but Oswald and Ruby both. Ruby came from what you might call the area where organized crime influenced politics in Chicago, And Lee Harvey Oswald and his family, particularly his uncle, Dutz Murrett, came from the milieu where organized crime influenced politics in New Orleans. Both his uncle and his mother had what we call shady, corrupt friends who were important in the, but particularly one faction, the Democratic Old Regulars of New Orleans, who typified the corrupt manipulation of local politics by those whose aim was to preserve this kind of milieu that we've been talking about. Seymour Weiss, director of Standard Fruit, personal friend of key mafia organized crime figures like Meyer Lansky and Jake Lansky. Also a friend of J. Edgar Hoover's, because the FBI knows about these things and uses them as allies or assets in combating left-wing politics. Seymour Weiss was a patron of the Democratic Old Regulars, and the Democratic Old Regulars regularly sent to Congress someone who could be counted on, a congressman who could be counted on to introduce private bills on behalf of specific mafia figures, just as the Democratic ward machine in Chicago regularly sent to Washington a Democratic congressman who had a son-in-law, Sam Giancana, the mafia figure, on his payroll in Washington. You have a deep political alliance between organized crime and politics on the ward level, and Ruby's family was part of that milieu in Chicago. Oswald's family was part of that milieu in New Orleans. And one way of linking this to what we said before is that when the House Select Committee on Assassinations for the first time acknowledged the relevance of organized crime to the assassination of President Kennedy, and they quite correctly focused on Oswald's uncle, who was a former prize fighter, manager of prize fights, a kind of layoff bookie, a gambler, and a taker of bets. But they didn't mention, which I think is just as relevant, the fact that he worked for years on the New Orleans waterfront, which was what we were talking about. And Lee Harvey Oswald himself, when he was just getting started in life, went off and worked for a stevedoring firm on the New Orleans waterfront. That was the heart and core of this deep political economy in New Orleans, which continuously elected so many corrupt mayors. I'm not talking about today, but in the past, and which illustrated this alliance that we've been talking about between corporate interest, banana companies, and organized crime. Oswald came out of that milieu.
Well, Oswald, of course, we associate those of us who are younger than you and I with, of course, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But some of the things about his family here, some of these matters I don't think have ever really come to light in any other presentation than what you're doing right now.
The other thing that is very striking about Oswald is that this is a man who spent most of his life in the shadows. But for 1 month, starting mid-July through late August 1963, this man was continuously on TV and conducted a radio debate which was extremely damaging for his reputation, because in the debate it was revealed that he was not only a Marxist, which he claimed. I don't think he really was. I think he was playing this role, but he admitted himself to be a Marxist, and then he was exposed to be a liar about his trip to the Soviet Union. And it was this tape which was played on all the American stations, and plus the TV footage of his being arrested and leafleting for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. All of this, I think, was public relations. It was a put-up job.
Program disinformation.
Exactly, and particularly if we take his leafleting for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, he hired someone to help him do it. And he told this person in advance, the person asked, how long are we going to leaflet? He said about 10 or 12 minutes. An FBI report said it only lasted for a few moments, and yet there was the TV cameras were there. Well, anyone who's had any experience leafleting knows how difficult it is to get TV cameras to come and film you, especially if you've only done it for a few minutes. It means you agreed with them to come in advance. Now, Godet, who said he knew Oswald, commented on that leafleting operation. He said himself, he was a PR man himself, and he said that was, I think, a PR operation for Ed Junior Butler. Now, Ed Junior Butler ran an organization called INCA, the Information Council of the Americas. The fruit companies put a lot of money into this thing because it essentially was generating anti-communist propaganda for use by the CIA in all of Latin America. And a charter member of INCA was Seymour Weiss, the director of Standard Fruit, who was had the contacts with organized crime at the highest national level. And INCA, we don't know for a certainty, we only have Godet's say-so that Butler was behind the leafleting, but we know very well who was responsible for the radio interview. Ed Butler was on that interview himself, and this interview was then packaged and distributed by the Information Council of the Americas, by INCA, something funded by the fruit companies. So there's been a lot of questioning about what was Oswald doing that month in New Orleans. And you had people like Jim Garrison say, oh, he was working for the CIA. And then you have people like Robert Blakey in the House Committee saying, no, he was working for organized crime or somehow being tracked by organized crime. But I think these are false distinctions. We know for a certainty that he was stamping his literature. Pro-communist literature was stamped with an anti-communist address, 544 Camp Street. So if anyone had been foolish enough to write into Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba Committee chapter in New Orleans, a one-man committee, it was just Oswald and no one else, their names and addresses would have been delivered to a man called Guy Bannister at this address, who was collecting information and giving it to the FBI. So some people say Bannister was working for the FBI, and then some people, the House Committee, say, but Bannister had links to Carlos Marcello's lawyer, and his anti-Castro operations were financed by organized crime. So no, he was working for organized crime. Now, what I'm trying to do with my deep political analysis is to get beyond what I think are false alternatives. Was he working for the FBI? Was he working for organized crime? And to see that over the years, particularly after World War II and the Great Red Scare of the 50s, that the FBI itself used organized crime as informants in a very big way, probably used them as covert operatives too. That is to say that gangsters were allowed to beat up on the left and to help break left-wing unions with the blessing and encouragement of the FBI and other parts of the U.S. government. We had a deep political structure in which organized crime and intelligence enemies were not enemies opposed to each other, but were allies against a third force, which was a mutual enemy, that is to say, any kind of organized political activity on the left. And Oswald in New Orleans, with his leafleting, was, I believe, part of that kind of collaboration between government and private sources to help, in this case, defeat the organizations like the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which were pro-Castro and were therefore targeted by the U.S. government and by the CIA in particular, and that's why Oswald inserted himself into the Fair Play for Cuba Committee to help discredit it.
Did Kennedy order the shutdown of the covert activities in the anti-Castro area?
This is an extremely complicated question. I think one can say that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, of late 1962. He certainly cut back on them. He had agreed with Khrushchev that the United States would not directly invade Cuba. In 1963, the Kennedy administration, at what level I don't know, made a decision that I think was very ill-advised. They decided to have two types of anti-Castro operations. The first would be the army-trained Cubans under Manuel Artime, so-called Operation Second Naval Guerrilla, which went on for about 2 years. Was finally closed down in 1965 amid accusations that they had been using their special situation in their camps and so on to smuggle drugs. And then their second track was to take all these unmanageable Cubans and give them money to do whatever they liked as long as they didn't do it inside the United States. Now, there was a reason for this, and I understand Kennedy's thinking. Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which almost led to nuclear war, was resolved by some kind of agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev to pull back on both sides, and that Kennedy would not invade Cuba and Khrushchev would not put any more missiles there. Now, the unmanageable Cubans hated this agreement, as you can imagine. And what they started to do in early 1963, and I'm afraid there were some U.S. corporations backing them in this, they started to attack Soviet installations and ships in Cuba. In other words, to break the Kennedy-Khrushchev understanding and to, among other things, recreate the risk of a nuclear confrontation over Cuba. So when they came to this second track to get groups like Alpha 66 and the DRE, exactly the Cubans that Oswald was dealing with, by the way, in late 1963, to get these people into a situation where they could not threaten Soviet-American détente, the decision was give them money, let them do what they like, even give them some American advisors, but get them out of the United States. And many of us have suspected that it was that second element of Cubans who had the biggest motive to hate Kennedy and had the right kind of connections to both the intelligence community, CIA, and the U.S. Army, and also organized crime, that they were the ones who were in a position to be part of a conspiracy to kill the president, although I certainly don't think that they by themselves could have killed the president. One of the indications that this group of Cubans were politically important and involved in domestic U.S. politics and not just overseas covert operations was Watergate, when many of the same Cubans and many of the same handlers of these Cubans who had been in the environment of the Kennedy assassination in '63 became players, and in some cases rather principal players, in the Watergate events of 1972. I always like to talk about the case of Frank Sturgis, who was not a Cuban, although the press, in its odd ways, frequently referred to him as one of the Cubans who broke into Watergate. He certainly broke into Watergate. He certainly was not a Cuban. He had a background in organized crime, had been connected to the casinos, etc. And in 1963, he was circulating a lot of false stories about Oswald that found their way into the massive FBI documentation that went to the Warren Commission. And I had written about him in 1971 as someone who should be looked at closely for his, because I was arguing then that there was some kind of intelligence mafia collaboration in the killing of the president. And I said, without accusing him of anything in particular, that we should look more closely at Frank Fiorini. That was his name in those days. And so you can imagine how amazed I was in 1972, a year later, when these four men were picked up in in the Democratic National Committee for the Watergate burglary, and Frank Sturgis, alias Fiorini, was one of those people.
These people just keep showing up in our future scandals, is that it?
Then I wrote a book about the Iran-Contra affair, and by now I had to have a whole chapter on the continuity of U.S. political crises like Watergate, Iran-Contra, and you scratch down beneath the surface, and there are these Cubans not organizing these crises, but being used as ground troops by those intelligence operators in or out of government who were trying to manipulate U.S. politics by these various intrigues.
The Warren Commission, the official body investigating the assassination of John F. Kennedy, didn't it have Allen Dulles as a major player in?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And he, of course, goes back into the very beginnings of the CIA as it's been involved in the corruption.
And the use of organized crime that all happened when he was the director of Central Intelligence. We call it the Warren Commission because it was headed by Chief Justice Warren, but the commission had to go around and interview witnesses, and we have the attendance records of all the commission members. Now, I don't know how to place Chief Justice Warren in this, but of all the other members, Allen Dulles was far and away the most assiduous. He was the one who was sometimes, it was a meeting of the commission even if there was only one person there. And the person, apart from the chairman, and maybe even including the chairman, the person who was most likely to be there was Allen Dulles by far. Now, you could say that's because he had nothing else to do. He had had a row with Kennedy. Kennedy had been, of course, appalled with the results of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. It was a terrible political crisis for him domestically. And after review of it, Kennedy's solution was to fire or accept the resignation of Allen Dulles, something that he felt very bitter about. And Dulles and his friends used the pages of Life magazine, which was virtually a player in this whole anti-Castro operation, in order to say it was Kennedy's fault and not Dulles's fault that the operation failed so disastrously. In fact, I'm on this particular one would say I would agree with the Kennedy people that it was an operation that couldn't possibly have succeeded, and it was the grossest of folly to have done it. In other words, that Dulles was rightly fired. So he had an anti-Kennedy motive. I think you can say it was a conflict of interest to put him on the commission, or looking at it from a deep political perspective, you can say that he was put on that commission precisely because he knew where the corpses were buried in the CIA and knew how to steer the commission away from anything that would embarrass the CIA and with them the U.S. corporate establishment. For example, the fact that the CIA and the Mafia had been setting up assassination teams to assassinate Castro, but who had become a disposal problem because they weren't being allowed to assassinate Castro anymore. Clearly evidence that should have been brought to the Warren Commission right away, and yet was not, and the verdict of historians who studied this much more closely than I have said that not only the CIA in general, and then they named particular James Angleton and Ray Roca, the two counterintelligence top people in the CIA. Angleton was a very close friend of Allen Dulles, but Dulles also played a role in steering the Warren Commission away from what should, in fact, have been one of the very first areas that they investigated. So it is absolutely appropriate to draw attention to Allen Dulles's role on the commission.
You mentioned, or you talked to a journal here in the Berkeley area about the conspiration. Ticklen, yes. The conspiring of various government agencies to make a cover-up here. Would you expound on that a little bit?
Well, there is no question that I'll just talk about my area, because if we had a panel of 4 or 5 people, they'd probably each give you
They'd want to
a
have their
different
say
area.
too, yes.
My area is the politics of the case, and I think I was one of the first to argue back around 1971 or 72 about an intelligence mafia collaboration as underlying the politics of this assassination. That, I may say, was before the CIA had conceded, as it later did, that it had collaborated with the mafia on assassination projects. I would say the first agency I would mention would be an agency which I do not think actively conspired to kill the president, but certainly conspired to cover it up, would be the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover in particular. And in effect, the Warren Commission had very little room to wriggle in because, as they themselves said at their first secret meeting in early '64, J. Edgar Hoover had already told the nation that the case was solved, that Lee Harvey Oswald did it, and that he acted alone. The role of Hoover in inducing a prearranged cover-up, I think, is unmistakable. At the same time, I don't think we've begun to solve the case by saying that, because I do not think that I think Hoover was induced to do that because the truth, if known, would have been so embarrassing to the FBI. And I am sure that if Hoover had planned the assassination, which I don't think he did, I'm sure he didn't, he would not have planned it in such a way that it would be embarrassing to the FBI. And he would not have used as a patsy someone, Lee Harvey Oswald, who almost certainly had some kind of FBI connection. So then who else might there be? Well, there could be the CIA. They certainly covered up on the CIA mafia plots. But you know what I just said about the FBI applies here too. If the CIA mafia connection was what embarrassed the government into covering everything up, which I think is very likely, then I think it is unlikely that the CIA planned it that way. We are talking about someone else who was in a position to predict how the CIA and the FBI would react. Now, there's one other agency which played a much bigger role in this than is often mentioned, and that's Army intelligence. Many people don't know that there were Army intelligence agents, at least one, maybe more, in Dealey Plaza before, during, and after the assassination, and that one of them, a man called James Powell, actually ended up inside the school book depository at a time when it was supposedly sealed off to keep all outsiders away, and this Army intelligence agent was present at key moments such as the discovery of the rifle linked to Oswald, and also there was an Army intelligence who had met with Oswald's case agent, James Hosty of the FBI, and possibly with one of the more suspicious of the Dallas police lieutenants on the case as well. Another relevant fact is that you had a big Army intelligence reserve in Dallas, and that a number of the Dallas Police Special Security Bureau officers who play a special role in this case were simultaneously police intelligence officers and Army Intelligence Reserve officers. In my book, I attach a lot of importance to the fact that Marina's first interviews were conducted with the help of Russian emigres from this Russian emigre community in Dallas, which the Oswalds were part of, and that her testimony was in small but significant ways altered, and altered by the interpreter, and that the interpreter for one of these interviews was, for some reason that we should get to the bottom of, selected for the task and telephoned for the task by the head of a local Army Intelligence Reserve unit. So I think that if there's any single part of the government to which I would point for possible criminal complicity in covering up, as opposed to simply covering up for the national security or to protect the reputation of their own agencies, I would begin with certain units inside Army intelligence, those units working with the Cuban exiles, which they were in 63, including Cuban exile units like Alpha 66, which were particularly hostile to Kennedy and therefore designated to the Track 2 unmanageable category that we were talking about. And I would look to Army Intelligence Reserve units too, because a lot of these people were not just Army Intelligence Reserve, but were simultaneously part of this Dallas corporate structure which lived in symbiosis with organized crime. The man who picked the interpreter was the head of an Army Intelligence Reserve unit. He was also an oil man, and a man whose companies had been involved with oil exploration in the Caribbean, in Cuba, and possibly also in Haiti, which is something we can't get into, but part of the whole assassination story. Now, I want to make it clear, I do not think that the whole of this enormous case can be resolved, reduced to the behavior of people inside government. The whole deep political analysis is to say that there are people inside the government who have long-term relations which nobody invented but are just there with other people outside of government, including criminal elements from organized crime, but also the corporate community. And I think that the blame will be found to be spread between all those elements, and that a truly capacious investigation of this thing would study the actual link-ups between individuals in all of these elements of the American deep political structure. But the reason why simply saying the mob did it or Carlos Marcello did it, as so many people have tried to do, is that the way in which the case is covered up is part of the history of the case, and that people inside government are crucial to that second part of the case, even if some of them were manipulated into the role they played. They were manipulated by people who had intimate knowledge of how they behaved and were part of the same bureaucratic world that they were in.
It seems time to specifically focus upon the John F. Kennedy assassination. Without focusing on who or how the assassination was accomplished, can you tell us about the deep politics surrounding that event?
Well, this is what I think is the ongoing interest in the case. You know, it's very likely that the actual marksmen who shot the president were killed very shortly afterwards themselves. Who knows? But whatever, they're probably dead now. So many people think, well, therefore, it's only a historical question, a question of curiosity. But if you take a deep politics approach and you say that there was a symbiosis between law enforcement and criminal elements that was around at that time, and that we have to look to this deep political structure for the explanation not only of how you could have the assassination, but much more importantly, how it could be covered up afterwards, which means that you could have a change of presidency without any prosecution of the people who had killed the president, and that's what you're faced with if Lee Harvey Oswald was not the assassin, as he almost certainly wasn't. So it's, many people have said, you know, it couldn't possibly have been a conspiracy to kill the president, because in an open society like America, you could not have such a large conspiracy operate successfully without the true truth leaking out. But if you come up with the deep political alternative explanation that there are forces in place which kill regularly or try to kill and are never brought to justice for it, then to add one more killing, even though it is different in kind because it's the killing of the president, is not such an extraordinary thought. But it does leave us with a very disturbing consequence that we are talking about deep political arrangements not just in place in 1963, but which have been in place since the turn of the last century or earlier, and which essentially are still in place in 1993 when we're conducting this interview. So That's what I think is the most serious question today. Not the whodunit, but how it was done, and particularly where do you get the interface between people who were charged with the defense of the Constitution working with people who subverted the Constitution by killing the president. For a society not to be interested in that question, when nowadays nearly everybody agrees that it was not a one-man job, and that certainly Ruby's killing of Oswald was not a one-man job, once you concede that Ruby's killing Oswald was not a one-man job, we are dealing with a conspiracy which went undetected because of cover-up at the highest level. There has been behavior from all sides of the American establishment about this case that from a European perspective is lunatic, is insane, is a symptom of something wrong in a very broad way. What was very clearly true in 1978, I think, recreated itself again with the response to the Oliver Stone film. I don't really want to be defending the film because I myself thought he took a lot of liberties with the truth. But the kind of panic public relations campaign against this movie with what it said about Vietnam. And paradoxically, this is where I think Oliver Stone was really onto something. He was saying that Kennedy was implementing a plan to get out of Vietnam and that this was reversed 2 days after the assassination. I believe this is true. And even if the facts are shadowy and arguable and nobody has all the evidence, it's at least a proposition which historians ought to take seriously. Instead, you had a public relations campaign against this movie on this area where it was correct that began 6 or 7 months before the film was even released. And the same players, the Washington Post and the New York Times, and I think also the Wall Street Journal, the so-called responsible media, meaning the media which are closest to the intelligence community, which get their news from the CIA, and therefore, time after time, protect the CIA even when it is most scandalously wrong. I have a whole chapter about the media and the protection of the CIA drug connection in my book, Cocaine Politics. It's hard to give a bottom line there, but it is certainly true to say that the worst misrepresentation of the true facts about that thing is likely to be found in what we call the most responsible newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, because they are the ones closest to the CIA. And their protection, their suppression of the realities about the assassination is very analogous to their very easily documented suppression of the realities about the flow of drugs into this country from third world forces who are CIA allies and who are getting CIA protection when every now and then some of their people are arrested in this country. This is simply a story you're not going to read in the New York Times or the Washington Post. And the New York Times version of the Kennedy assassination has been absurd since the very beginning, when the mass media were saying that you see on the Zapruder film Kennedy turning around and looking back, and that's why you have an entrance, a wound of entry in the throat, because Oswald, the president turned back and looked at Oswald. A complete fiction, you might say a complete lie, but a good example of the responsible media working very hard to impede a proper investigation of a murder of the deepest, gravest constitutional significance.
You suppose that the media are looking for simple answers, and they tend to want to feed to their readership the kind of information they want to hear about and giving a simple response? Or is there perhaps some conspiracy here other than the loose interest and the
well, for the most part, I wouldn't use the word conspiracy here. I would use the word consensus.
Consensus.
This question deserves a 2-hour answer, and most of the first chapter of my book, Deep Politics, is talking about collective repression and denial of communal. I used to be a diplomat. That means to say I used to be a bureaucrat. And I know from personal experience how if you want to flourish in a bureaucracy, you learn to think the way everyone else thinks. I worked in the NATO division, and it was a cardinal but allegedly secret principle of NATO planning that the Russians had 175 divisions massed on their side of the Iron Curtain for imminent invasion of the Western Europe. And I was new in the job, and I naively asked a very stupid question. I asked my boss, I said, how do we know there are 175 divisions there? And he sort of, I'll never forget him sitting back and sort of looking at me and screwing up his eyes as if, what are you trying to do, spoil all the fun, you know? Now, I think with the Kennedy assassination, you didn't have to go around and tell people how to behave, what to do. Everyone automatically protected their part of the government. And this is not a conspiracy. This is bureaucratic behavior. In 1963, the media liked to print what J. Edgar Hoover told them.
Of course.
Among other things, J. Edgar Hoover had thick dossiers on nearly every journalist, editor, publisher, politician. There were very few people who would go. J. Edgar Hoover said within 48 hours, we have the assassin. He's Lee Harvey Oswald. He acted alone. Anyone who said, Hoover's off his nut, we have to investigate this before we say this, was clearly not a team player. And by bureaucratic definition, if you're not a team player, you don't belong in high office in Washington. So it's that state of mind, I think, that for most people contributed not only to the suppression of the realities about the assassination, but the realities of the fact that Kennedy, in October of 1963, signed a National Security Action Memorandum, number 263 of October the 11th, 1963, which implemented a previously approved plan to withdraw 1,000 troops from Vietnam by the end of 1963 with a view to completing the bulk of the removal of all troops, the bulk of them by the end of 1965. This is a relevant fact, and yet huge, thick histories of Vietnam have been written by responsible academic historians which do not mention this fact. One of them even writes about the approval of the plan in May of 63, but not the implementation of the plan in October 63. And I phoned him and I said, he's a good man, by the way, a good historian who has done very helpful work throughout his life. But in his well-documented book on Vietnam, he is silent about the implementation of a plan whose approval he describes. The implementation was a lot more important than the approval. So I phoned him and I said, why didn't you write about Nassim 263 of October the 11th? And he was very embarrassed, and he sort of coughed and he said, you understand, I'm an old man and I'm trying to finish my research in another area and I just didn't want to get into all that. First significant statement. I suppose I was too influenced by what others had written on the subject. What he really meant was he was influenced by what others had not written on the subject. It was just obviously too sensitive a matter because it raises questions about how did we get into Vietnam? Was it because a president was assassinated after he had begun to implement a withdrawal plan? Now, if you're listening to me, I am not saying that that is why the president was assassinated, but I am saying that is why the whole question of Nassim 263 is such a sensitive subject, because it's in the area of the assassination that people just don't want to think about, because if they begin to think it was a successful assassination by people who went unpunished, that raises unthinkable questions about the legitimacy of the succession of political power in this country.